displaced exiles, and there's essentially this outside political contestation taking place outside the region. How does this affect the actual democratization of Central Asia, either directly or indirectly?
So I think the important thing to remember is that when we talk about that Central Asia has no political opposition, we talk about its authoritarianism, that's a consequence, right? That's the result of a lot of the opposition actually moving outside of the region. So what we see in these categories of exiles, former regime insiders and family members, on the one hand, human rights activists and journalists on the other, also some religious figures, and some sort of former sort of business associates and insiders. Is a very heterogeneous group of exiles who are outside. In some cases, they directly try and affect democratization. They fund independent media or alternative media. They try and expose corruption scandals involving the ruling elite. They basically claim the mantle of democratic opposition. But in many other cases, they just want to lay low and get on with their lives. So what's really interesting is that the politics, the contestation, it's there, it's taking place, but it's taking place in spaces we don't normally think of necessarily even as political. In arbitration proceedings, in courtrooms, in legal battles. That's where we see a lot of this.
Are there any lessons that can be drawn from Central Asia that can be applied elsewhere, or are they, generally speaking, just for Central Asia?
So I think there are definitely some lessons that can be applied. I think what makes Central Asia distinct is that it's sort of a case of a transition country meeting globalization where you didn't get the kind of democratic state building that you got in East Europe. In some ways, unmediated globalization led to sort of Central Asian elites engaging in kleptocracy, fine-tuning their sort of resources in the service of authoritarianism and so forth. The actual lessons are that we're a big part of this, and I mean this in the West, that we have categories of actors, whether it's real estate brokers who sell luxury condos, whether it's second citizenship providers, whether it's our shell companies that are registered in places like the UK or the US that facilitate these transactions, that a lot of these transactions take place in our spaces. So I think what Central Asia teaches us is that authoritarianism and side-by-side kleptocracy, they now operate on a global scale, and Western institutions are as much part of this as the spaces in which authoritarianism and corruption supposedly take place.
One of the big geopolitical questions going on is obviously the actions taken by China and Russia globally. What, if you could just expand a little bit more on the interests or influence that they have in this region?
Yeah. So here we're seeing a switch. Post 9/11, for about 10 years, we had three great powers heavily engaged in the region. It was the United States that needed logistical support for its military campaign in Afghanistan and established supply lines and military bases in the region. It was a resurgent Russia under Vladimir Putin, who wanted to re-engage with Central Asia and check Western influence, especially after 2003. And it was China that was just starting what is now really a vast economic network in the region, providing everything from investment to pipelines to loans, these kinds of economic governance functions too. What you've seen post-2014 is that there is a perception that the U.S. is disengaged, that it's withdrawing from Afghanistan, that it's losing interest in Central Asia, that a region and doesn't have a compelling interest. And on the other hand, you see China and Russia increasing their presence, especially post-Ukraine. Russia wants to have a sphere of influence, and China now, with its One Belt, One Road initiative, wants to integrate Central Asia in how it connects China with regions of the world like Europe and the Middle East. So what you see is all the Central Asian states want to practice multi-vectorism. They want to play great powers off one another. They don't want to be locked into any one particular country. But in practice, it's becoming more difficult because both Russia and China, their influence is growing, and there hasn't been that third country like the US that can offer them an alternative.